So this video has a content warning for anxiety, depression, assault, spousal abuse, child abuse, suicide, and disability. I've marked this where appropriate, but just these are important to what I discuss. It's hard to avoid them. I've done my best. Thank you. So, with the release of the final Rebuild movies, I kind of wanted to revisit and talk about some of the things from the Eva series that I really quite enjoyed that was music related. Also, I just can't not talk about Eva 24/7. So I've played in concert bands, I've played in jazz bands, I've done solo stuff, I've done acoustic, electronic music, I have just done quite a bit of music stuff, and definitely throughout all of that time, a lot of the choices for music in Eva still resonates with me quite a bit. Certainly most people are aware of the influences that, the animators wore on their sleeves when it comes to animation, of course, and science fiction being another one. But when people tend to analyze Eva, they don't always talk about the music as much. Of course, we could talk about the use of the timpani part from 007 Takes the Lecter from the movie From Russia with Love, which has been used as something for decisive battle. Personally, it's not something quite as interesting to me. I don't think it's as important to focus on in this particular instance. We could talk about the Showa-era songs that Mari sings in the Rebuild movies, as well as a selection from Space Battleship Yamato, a selection from Canon, also known as His and Her Circumstances, the latter of which was composed by Shiro Sagasu, also the composer for Evangelion throughout the years. And it goes without saying that Shiro Sagasu's choices and his body of work has definitely played an impact on what we are going to get out of Evangelion, of course. Now, having said all that about Shiro Sagasu, what I actually want to focus on today, though, is the selection of music from Death and Rebirth and then End of Evangelion. Death and Rebirth was released March 15, 1997. It is commonly known under either the name Death and Rebirth or Death True or Death True 2. So, the song that we're going to focus on for the first bit of this video is going to be Pachebel's Canon. It is used through a few different moments in Death and Rebirth. Then we're going to shift focus more onto End of Evangelion, which uses a song that is homaging Pachebel's Canon and some other songs. So there'll be a bit of a discussion kind of linking these two threads together between the song Pachebel's Canon as well as Come Susur Tat, or Come Sweet Death. So I don't think anybody who has seen End of Evangelion will ever really forget the moment when Come Susur Tat happens. It's a lot. It's just a lot. But having said that, there isn't always as much discussion about the use of Pachebel's Canon in Death and Rebirth. Of course, we do have to think about it a little bit in terms of one is an original work for the movie, one of them is a classical piece, so there is a difference there. Death and Rebirth as well, a big part of, the lack of people wanting to experience it is because it is a compilation movie. I know for myself for years, it wasn't something that I really thought I needed to seek out or thought was necessary to watch. I mean, it's a good movie in a sense, but it is a compilation movie. It's telling you the story of the 26 episodes that you already just watched, and that makes it a little hard to sell for most people. The movie has a framing device that is used where, interspersed with the series events, it also shows 18 months before Shinji had ever gone to Tokyo 3. In fact, he's still in Tokyo 2, and he's at a string quartet practice. Shinji plays the cello in the string quartet, and it's only brought up once in the original series, in a moment where after Asuka comes back from a date that has failed, Shinji is just practicing the cello in the apartment. He had dug it out, and Asuka is like, oh, like actually kind of impressed by him doing it, and Shinji just kind of remarks that he only really kept at it because nobody told him to stop, which just kind of, that's him in a nutshell. And as this framing device goes on, we start to even see, though, that there are other characters who are in the quartet, of course, but one looks like Asuka, one looks like Rei, one looks like Kaworu, and it's interesting because it's almost as if, like these aren't actually those people. We know that they are not due to the context of the show having happened, but these are also kind of maybe representative of people in Shinji's life that were similar to these people that came afterwards. So this framing device goes on. A lot of it, of course, is in time with the series. It is roughly in chronological order, but certain characters may appear, as kind of background characters until they are formally introduced as a part of this framing device. Shinji himself is introduced by bringing the cello to the venue. He pulls it out, he sighs, and then he starts playing the Suite for Cello Solo No. 1 in G major, the Prelude by Bach. He also plays some Dvorak later on as well, which is used primarily in some moments where he is quite stressed out and grimacing in pain. Now, I really enjoy when Asuka shows up. She's just a lot of fun in this moment here, because she, actually has a bit of back and forth with Shinji more than some of the other characters. She asks, oh, what are we playing today? Oh, it's Pachebel's Canon. Oh, geez, it's so easy for you. And you're just playing arpeggios, and no, that's not what Shinji's part is on the cello. It's so continue, but whatever. I'm getting too nerdy about this stuff. But anyways, it's just one of those things that, I really enjoy. Just the good character writing of these two just poking at each other. Asuka plays the second violin part in the canon. She warms up with the Partita No. 3 for violin solo in E major, Cavatin Rondo. My apologies for the pronunciation there. When Rei shows up, Rei is acknowledged by Shinji, but she does not acknowledge him, which Asuka actually, laughs at them both for. Rei plays the viola and is going to be also playing the third part. When Kaworu arrives, Asuka gets angry at him for being late, and he kind of blows it off a little bit. He's the first violinist in the production. He's pretty relaxed compared to anybody else there. He asks if Shinji is ready to go. He replies yes, and then the canon, it begins. The school is shown in various pan shots, and just quite a number of pretty little shots that are done there of backgrounds that were painted for the show. Then we see Toji, who is remembering the moment that he punched Shinji for being the Eva pilot that harmed his sister. The music cuts out at this point. He is grappling, of course, with the fact that now he has to be an Eva pilot, which he is not quite ready for, of course. Further recap, of course, happens. We see, the distraction of Unit 03 and Toji's injury, of course. Once the movie is mostly done, there is the credits scene, which is Blasted Out Tokyo 3, with Pachebel's Canon playing over top of the credits. As the song ends, Shinji is shown walking out from the practice space to a very loud to be continued door slam sound. So bringing it back to the various character interactions between them, I think it's interesting just that it kind of shows, what if this was an alternate world almost? What if, Shinji wasn't an Eva pilot? Much of Shinji's stress does not really come down to piloting so much as the act of doing something. It could have been anything. It could have been, his cello practice. It could have been, animation. It could have been sports. It could have been a lot of things. And I think it's really important that this is a big part of the movie, is establishing a pre-Evangelion Shinji. A Shinji that is not stuck being an Eva pilot. So, having established all this, I want to move on to discussing the various kinds of music that have been used in Eva prior to this. So, of course, we have Fly Me to the Moon, which has been used for the credits in multiple different arrangements. I always really quite like that arrangement. Doing it as a more pared back, intimate kind of sounding bossa nova kind of feel always felt a little bit nicer to me. I prefer it to the Sinatra version as a result. But regardless, there's, other things such as Handel's Messiah, the use of Ode to Joy, obviously the pieces I mentioned that were used, of course, in Death and Rebirth that I mentioned from Pachebel's Canon and the Gavaton Rondo. In End of Evangelion, of course, there are also some other pieces used, such as Orchestral Suite No. 3 by Bach, and I didn't want to butcher the German pronunciation of this, unlike Gavaton Rondo, but anyways, Heart and Mouth and Deed and Life is used as well. So, of course, there's a few reasons why this kind of music is used in a show like this. First thing that comes to mind to me, of course, is cost. Royalty-free music can be a little bit easier budget-wise, just because you're not paying for certain kinds of rights that you might normally have to pay for. Of course, it helps, too, that all of these pieces were written by Christian European composers. So in a series that is using Christian imagery as much as it is, I think it's really important that, obviously, you're using this music that has a bit of a glory to God kind of feel to it. So it makes quite a bit of sense to me to use that in terms of a thematic choice as well. And so, briefly, since so much of this is religious and so much iconography in the movie is religious, let's just kind of deal with that just briefly. I generally am of the position that Anno thinks it looks cool, and he grew up watching Ultraman, which was, of course, created by a practicing Catholic. So he definitely was taking that iconography and using it in his own ways. Now, there are, of course, some important parallels to note in terms of just, okay, who uses the imagery the most. Now, of course, Masato has a literal cross that she wears. It is one that she also is literally bearing through this whole series. It was given to her by her father, who died because of the angels, and she is working her damnedest to prevent any kind of tragedy like that from occurring again. A lot of this is wrapped up in sort of her feelings, though, where she's so driven on trying to do as much as she can to stop it, that she doesn't really want to let herself have as many pleasurable things. Like, she enjoys some very simple things in her life, and she seems to be quite ashamed of them at most times, whether it's just how she lives, the beer and food that she enjoys, the fact that she is ashamed of dealing with Kaji, or actually enjoys having sex, things like that, are things that are hard for her to grapple with as someone who is so bent on completing this mission of hers and bearing this cross. I think in this sense that it's kind of important to consider that Christianity itself as a religion has a bit of a left-hand and right-hand dissonance too, and Masato personifies it a little bit in my mind. On one hand, you have a very compassionate and forgiving person, someone who will do all this great stuff and is totally carefree, while on the other hand, you have eternal damnation and all this seriousness and this personal mission and cross to bear on the other hand. And Masato living that dissonance is such a big part of her character that I think that even with the iconography of the show being Christian, it's important to note that she really embodies it. So now let's bring it back a bit to Pachebel's canon. Having discussed a little bit of the fact that a lot of the music used was religious, Pachebel's canon is also kind of seen as a religious piece. It has elements of either a wedding song or a funeral song. It has been used in both of those contexts over the years. It is one of those songs that is interesting to consider just because of the type of song it is. It's a canon. A canon itself is a compositional technique where you have a very strict set of imitation. Somebody starts a part and then keeps going and keeps basically having, an entirely original score that they do. But usually another part will start on another instrument that repeats what the first player did a few bars earlier. The first part, the second part, and the third part in Canon in D, where the second part is a few bars removed from the first, and the third a few from the second, and a few more from the first. So, of course, some simple examples of this are, Frere Jacques, or Row Your Boat. These are, very common forms of what a canon is. The song itself is now considered famously overused. There was a time it was not known to many people, much like, Bach himself. Pachebel was relatively obscure in his day, fairly prolific now. He was not exactly a famous, widely known person in the 17th century. It wasn't until about 1919 that his work was first rediscovered and brought back into a public light. And even with that, most people were not really aware of Pachebel's canon until about 1968, when a specific recording by Francois-Paillard kind of came out, and that kind of boosted its notoriety, so to speak. From there, it kind of became its own thing. It's one of the most parodied and used chord progressions in music history at this point. I've used it. PDQ Bach has made a song about it as a joke, and there's the Pachebel's Rant. Just so many songs have referenced it over the years that it is now even a joke to talk about how overused Pachebel's canon is. But why is canon in D the theme for Death and Rebirth? It's interesting. I was passing my notes to my friend Kmoy. Go buy his album, the Precure album. Just do it. Just buy it. Just go buy it now. He was helping me by checking my notes, and he brought up that Canon in D actually never really sounded that happy to him. It's, a major tonality as a key, but that's a brightness, but it's not necessarily its mood. And what he explained to me really stuck with me quite a bit. It's that the progression, roughly, of the few bars of the main passage of the chords kind of expresses you're born, you experience some struggle, some sadness, maybe some love and loss, you grow old, you die, and then you begin again. It's a very much literal take of, death and rebirth. And, of course, rebirth is always a bit of a religious topic, but there is kind of a couple ways to look at it. There is the more Eastern Buddhist kind of philosophy of it, which unfortunately I just don't know enough to really speak too much on, but it's something that would have very much been closer to Anno and his perspective on things. Plus also, of course, like the Christian concept of, rebirth of Christ, or like rebirth in the kingdom of God. And of course, to jump ahead a little bit to End of Evangelion, it is interesting to me that when offered a choice to get out of what would be considered the cycle of suffering, Shinji is aware that he is choosing that cycle of suffering and goes back to an existence that's going to bring him a lot of pain. So before moving on to End of Evangelion and Kamsutra Todd, I'm going to throw a curveball into things and talk about the other song that is important to understanding Kamsutra Todd, and that is the Beatles' Hey Jude. So of course, Hey Jude, written by Paul McCartney for John Lennon's son Julian Lennon, meant to cheer him up because of the rough situation that he was experiencing at the time. Julian Lennon and Cynthia Lennon were unfortunately victims of John Lennon when he would get abusive and he would beat them. It's a big part of the reason why they did not stay together, and it's one of those things that I think is unfortunately just the context for this song. As much as I enjoy this song, and I am not going to tell people to not enjoy the Beatles, but unfortunately this is an aspect that has to be a little bit reconciled with the reality of the situation. It's worth noting too that certainly John Lennon did not experience a great childhood himself and likely dealt with his own issues of being abused by his own parents. This is largely through their kind of neglect of him as a child. I definitely think that it shows a little bit of an issue that Evangelion deals with of this generational trauma, but I want to be very clear that a lot of what I'm going to talk about in some of this middle section has to do with real people, and I do not want to belittle these real experiences that people experienced and the harm that they suffered. I will be talking about these experiences because they are a bit of context for a lot of what's going to be discussed further. But I want to make it clear that I am not judging people for having gone through these experiences. I do not think that it is as simple as these experiences explain certain decisions made. And I think it's important to also be able to separate, as much as I'm probably going to fail to in later sections, separate the art and the artist a little bit and do that a bit of death of the author. I think Anno is well aware of the context of Hey Jude, and as a result, it's also important just to note just how much of, Hey Jude just is about a character dealing with the problems of being in the world. It's quite literally lines said to Shinji at multiple points in this series. It's, you need to let people into your heart. Don't be afraid. Don't carry the world on your shoulders. It's just one of those things that it's interesting to me considering this song in that context. And wow, what a shock that a song about a kid with an abusive father and we're talking about, Evangelion. So, I mean, that's the obvious thing to me lyrically. It's also the instrumentation. It's very obvious that somebody sat down when they were going to write Kamsutra Todd and they went, what is the instrumentation for Hey Jude? And then they said, well, let's get that, but let's not hire the brass players. But it's so close, and it's just really interesting to me just having that pretty obvious kind of take on it. It also has a very similar sound to it. It has the chords that were used in Pachebel's Canon, of course, being used on that one, but just overall the feel is just frickin' Hey Jude, and some very obvious lines used throughout it that are direct quotes from Hey Jude, including, the nanas at the end of Hey Jude being played by the violins at the end of Kamsutra Todd. The other thing I think about with this is since we had Rebuild 3.0 plus 1.0 released, Amazon also released the documentaries about the production, and they also released a fireside chat. Both of those were very interesting things to watch, just due to, you know, the curiosity of where has this person been, you know, and what have they been up to, and how did this happen, how did the movie come about, all those kinds of things. And just seeing him talk for the first time in a long time, just so candidly, even if it is, as he says, an on-camera version of himself, that documentaries aren't real and things like that, which is quite funny. It's quite interesting just because of the things that he does talk about. One of the things that Anno talks about quite a bit is his father, and his father was disabled pretty early into his life. He lost his leg in an accident while cutting a tree, which was said to have been the fault of the other person cutting the tree with him. A lot of stress seemed to have boiled up because of that, and as Anno said, his father seemed to resent the world for that. For Anno, it gave him a little bit of a desire to see things like his father in art, see imperfect things in a way that it always fascinated him when he saw things like robots missing an arm or a limb, and just kind of the, like, to him, a certain beauty in that kind of thing. And it's an interesting thing to consider that, like, he even goes as far as including that same injury being something that Toji in Evangelion experiences, of losing his leg due to the actions of somebody else. Now, this is an aside, but I really want to dig into this because I think it's just something that I really wanted to discuss a little bit. I think people tend to coddle Shinji a little bit too much when it comes to this moment. When Eva 03 is designated as an angel and Shinji is deployed to fight it, Shinji refuses, and that hesitation to take any action is what leads to the dummy system being used. It is entirely Shinji's fault that something like this happened. If he had found a way, he might have been able to save Toji and not experience that, and not lead to that accident having happened. At the end of the day, Shinji had no control over it. It was not him who did it, but his hesitation injured him. This is important too, I think, because in Rebuild, it's not Toji who experiences this, it's Asuka. And Asuka's a little bit more upfront about how upset this made her. It becomes really interesting to me because in the last Rebuild, she confronts him and asks him, "Why do you think I've been so mad at you?" And he responds with the correct answer that it's because I hesitated. I hesitated to save you, whereas I did not hesitate in multiple other circumstances that I probably should have hesitated, whether I knew or not. Of course, the original series has a moment where Asuka is failed by Shinji, of course. He is under lockdown. He cannot use his Eva unless specifically ordered to. And Asuka is fighting the angel that is in space. Of course, she is, and I hate having to use this word, violated to a certain extent mentally. She is not handling things, and that might have been a moment where in a traditional show, Shinji would have, rushed out to save the day, but it was Rei who saved her in that instance by throwing the spear at it in space. He didn't push to go out into the fray and try and help her. Everything got left to Rei. And when he goes and sees her after all of this, all she can respond to his words of, "I'm glad you're okay," are, "I don't really give a flying fuck what you think," basically. She is absolutely done with him pretending at all to care about her. And Shinji really does not understand to the extent that he has hurt her and how this is going to be important for End of Evangelion. So let's talk about End of Evangelion. It was released July 19th, 1997, and I am going to talk a little bit about what kind of leads up to basically when Kamsusurtat comes in. This next section is going to be quite rough, and if you haven't seen it, content warnings from the beginning apply here as well. So let's set the table before Shinji is going to toss it out. We see Shinji at his absolute worst. He masturbates over a comatose Asuka. He sits and does nothing for a good stretch of the movie. He is just kind of near catatonic himself. He doesn't act around the time that Masato is injured. He does not get in the Eva soon enough to be able to help Asuka before she is killed. He is then pulled into the conspiracy of doing instrumentality and is given stigmata by the Eva series. Gendo's plan falls apart, and Rei takes Adam, returns to Lilith, and then goes to see Shinji. Her and Kawaru appear to Shinji, and Shinji is then taken into kind of that world of introspection that he has been time and time again. This time, he is a child. There are hills and a sun, and it forms an outline of a body, with Shinji being between the legs, evoking a birth image. He is building a sandcastle, and some other girls who look like dolls appear and help him with it. At some point, their mother appears across the way. She picks him up, and they go, leaving him. He just sits there, and he keeps building the sandcastle and building it. And then it gets dark, and he destroys it. And then he rebuilds it again. Nobody told him to stop. Then there's a variety of scenes that occur, including Shinji seeing Masato and Kaji having sex, and of course Masato kind of pontificating on why she does it, and Asuka being upset about it and disapproving of it. Asuka also berating, Shinji for various things, including her being used for his jerk-off fantasies. She even goes so far as to say, "If I can't have you to myself, I won't let anybody else have you." Oh, God. And, just so many different scenes of Shinji just asking for help and screaming and having a tantrum and just, oh, God. The kitchen scene. Oh, God. So Shinji says he wants to help Asuka, and then Asuka tells him, "Great, leave me alone." He is very insistent that he wants to help and be helped by Asuka, and she then accuses him of, only wanting help because he doesn't trust anybody else in his life. He starts begging for her help, and she pushes him away. He falls into a coffee pot, throwing it all over the floor, and he just keeps asking for help over and over and over again as he destroys the fucking kitchen in a fucking glorious scene of him just trashing things like goddamn Citizen Kane, and she tells him no. He waits a second, and then he goes to choke her? And that's how Kmoy Todd starts. So, lyrically, I mean, the title is Come Sweet Death, for God's sakes. This was written by Anno. It was transcribed into English by Mike Wazgowski, somebody who has worked on Bleach with Sagasu. But largely the lyrics were written mostly by Anno and then turned into English for Ariane to sing. It is just so sad and depressing going through all of these. When you just read them line by line, it really shows just, I think, the state that Anno must have been at that time to have been that upset, to be that like frustrated with things, and just feeling like he let everybody down, it feels like. Obviously, this is a song about Shinji. Like, this isn't just about Anno, of course, but I think there is a lot to be said about what Anno was going through at that time. Post-production of the TV series, he was very depressed, according to the documentary. He goes into some rather explicit details about his suicide plans there, and it's really not good. And it's interesting to consider this as well, because this might not have been the song used originally. They also wrote a song, Everything You've Ever Dreamed Of, and that was possibly going to be used for this. It appears on as a kind of as a bonus track, basically, but it's not in the movie itself. And I'm kind of glad that it didn't get used. One, just Kmoy Todd is just a really good song. There is more of a musical through line, I think, as a result of using Pachebel's canon in the last movie, and now Kmoy Todd here, that you get that kind of feeling of a connectivity between the two. And Kmoy Todd is referencing, things from Pachebel's canon. And just lyrically, I just don't like the song as much. Like, it's interesting thinking about it, but I really find that Everything You've Ever Dreamed is a little bit more of someone wallowing in certain feelings as opposed to actually, recognizing their faults, it feels. I do not think that it would have worked as well. If it was a song maybe written in context of somebody like Gendo, I feel it fits a little bit better, largely because I think he really was abandoned by Yui, and there's just a little bit of a different feeling as a result if you consider it in that context. At the same time, the song just comes across as trying to accuse someone of something that I don't know really fits, because I do not think that Asuka or any of the other women in this show are as much to blame in that. I just want to touch on Kmoy Todd as something that I've just experienced a lot over the years. It's been rather close to me for a long time, since I first saw the movie way back. I was a depressed, sad 12-year-old. And I think it's really impressive that for this movie, the end of the world doesn't occur with, classical music or silence. It's a pop ballad about wanting to let yourself die and failing those around you. It really was quite formative for me as a 12-year-old when I saw it. My own family situation is not something I'll get into details about. Suffice to say, I did have a divorced set of parents, and my dad was distant, not cold, but distant from me to a certain extent in his own way. And everything that the series and the movies did just really stood out to me at the time and really helped me, I think, through some of those moments, even if it was quite a spectacle and can be depressing at times. And, you know, the music just really, like, stuck with me for such a long time. I still think Komm Süßer Tod is probably one of my favorite songs. I think that's why I wanted to talk about this kind of through line of the connections between the music and stuff like that, because certainly there is obviously the emotional things that occur in Death and Rebirth, in recapping the story, but also in exploring Shinji as a person before Eva, and then the very visceral experience of End of Eva. And I think that through line between Pachebel's canon as this emotional Death and Rebirth and Komm Süßer Tod as what the end looks like, it just made more sense for me to talk about as something that spoke to me a bit. Certainly there are some really great things that I could have said about, you know, the use of the song Karma in Rebuild, because that is a piece I love from Canon. It's something I've learned to play on piano. It's just absolutely a fantastic piece. But this just, it really hits me harder when I think about Komm Süßer Tod. That song is just a moment in time for me. It's like a little time capsule back to being 12 and amazed at what, you know, you could see in animation and, you know, experience, and like talking about it with friends and all of these things that you did, and speculating about what was going on or what did it really mean, all that kind of stuff. It's great. Like, I really enjoyed it. Lastly, I thought really hard about the final moments that Yui has in End of Evangelion, and talking about how Eva Unit 1 will outlive humanity. With the commercialization of the franchise, that may even be true now. But, you know, it's interesting thinking about, you know, what we leave behind, and kind of that time capsule kind of thing that we sometimes have done, you know, where we put stuff into a box and bury it and then open it up years later. And music is such a fleeting moment in time. It's played and remembered. I mean, certainly technology has changed this. It makes it easier for us to play stuff and go back with stuff like that. However, you know, it's still hard to say what is going to be remembered if we ever disappear as a species. And I started thinking about the Voyager space satellite, which is probably the closest thing we have to a monument to time, with the golden record that stored images and sounds that represent, you know, the time from when it was sent out. You know, music from around the world and things like that. Certainly some Bach as well. It actually included the Gavotten Rondo as well, that was used in Death and Rebirth. And I think it's amazing thinking about our legacy in time and space when grappling with the tragedy and pain of living on Earth. Like, it is so beautiful and profound and sad, though, to think about our lives being nothing but dust someday. But anywhere can be paradise, as long as you have the will to live. After all, you're alive, and so you will always have the chance to be happy. As long as the sun, the moon, and the earth exist, everything will be alright. I want to thank Rebella for supporting me through all this. I want to thank Kmoy, whose insights into the music and just as a friend has been very helpful in the last little bit. Also, I'd like to thank TheZackcat for providing the N64 footage that you saw earlier. And I would like to say thank you for watching. You may have noticed my voice is changing, and this is a lot of work, and this video has been a really fun experience for me to try out a different sound for my voice, and I don't think I was always happy with how it sounded, but that's kind of life, and I think that's okay. Thank you again, and goodbye.